Enhanced creative thinking. When you're an outsider, your brain isn't constrained by the same social rules and conventions that insiders follow without question. And that distance from the mainstream, it's basically a creativity superpower. Research shows that people who feel like outsiders consistently generate more innovative solutions and original ideas than those who are deeply embedded in groups. Your perspective isn't limited by how things are supposed to be done because you were never fully initiated into those systems in the first place. This happens because your brain doesn't automatically default to conventional approaches. While insiders are running on autopilot, following established patterns because that's what everyone does, you're actually thinking, you're questioning, you're seeing possibilities that don't even register for people who are too close to the system. Some of the most groundbreaking innovations in history came from outsiders who weren't bound by industry conventions or insider thinking. In practical terms, this makes you naturally better at creative problem solving, entrepreneurship, and any field that rewards original thinking over conformity. Your outsider status isn't holding you back creatively, it's giving you an edge most people will never have. Superior pattern recognition. Being on the outside gives you something insiders can rarely access: objectivity. When you're not emotionally invested in being part of the group, you can see patterns, contradictions, and dynamics that people on the inside are completely blind to. It's like watching a movie versus being in it. Insiders are so caught up in the drama, the politics, the day-to-day interactions that they can't see the bigger picture. You can. Research in social psychology shows that outsiders consistently identify group dynamics, power structures, and behavioral patterns more accurately than group members themselves. This happens because you're observing without the cognitive biases that come from wanting to belong or maintain your position. Your brain isn't filtering information through "what will this mean for my status?" or "how should I react to stay accepted?" You're just seeing what's actually there. And that clarity, that's an analytical advantage. In practical terms, this makes you better at strategic thinking, understanding complex systems, and spotting opportunities or problems before insiders even realize they exist. What looks like being on the sidelines is actually the best seat in the house for seeing the truth. Authentic identity development. Here's something most people don't realize. Being an outsider forces you to figure out who you actually are, not who you're supposed to be. When you're not accepted by default into a group, you don't get to build your identity on conformity. You have to dig deeper. And that process, while it can be painful, creates something insiders rarely achieve: a genuinely authentic sense of self. Most people construct their identities based on what their social group values, what gets them accepted, what maintains their belonging. It's identity by committee, but when you're an outsider, you can't do that. You have to answer harder questions like, what do I actually believe, and who am I when nobody's watching? Research in developmental psychology shows that people who experience social exclusion often develop stronger, more integrated identities than those who are easily accepted. This happens because you're forced to rely on internal validation rather than external approval. You learn to trust your own judgment, develop your own values, and become comfortable with who you are independent of what others think. The advantage here is profound. You end up with a self that's yours, not a reflection of social expectations. And that authenticity, it's magnetic, it's powerful, and it's something money can't buy and conformity can't build. Increased empathy and perspective taking. When you know what it feels like to be excluded, dismissed, or misunderstood, something shifts in how you see other people. You develop a kind of emotional intelligence that insiders often lack because they've never had to. Research shows that people who have experienced marginalization or outsider status consistently score higher on empathy measures and perspective-taking abilities. This isn't just about being nice. It's a genuine cognitive and emotional advantage. This happens because your brain has been forced to consider multiple perspectives just to navigate social situations. While insiders can assume everyone thinks like them, you've had to constantly read rooms, interpret subtle cues, and understand viewpoints different from your own just to survive socially. That's thousands of hours of empathy training that insiders never get. In practical terms, this makes you better at understanding clients, building diverse teams, navigating conflicts, and connecting with people from different backgrounds. You can read emotional subtext most people miss. You notice when someone's uncomfortable, excluded, or struggling because you've been there. And in an increasingly diverse world, that ability to genuinely understand and connect across differences isn't just nice to have. It's a competitive advantage in almost every field. Mental flexibility and adaptability. Outsiders live in multiple worlds. You navigate the mainstream culture, your own identity, maybe several different social contexts that don't quite overlap. And all that code switching, all that adaptation, all that figuring out how to exist in spaces that weren't designed for you, it's building serious cognitive flexibility. Neuroscience research shows that people who regularly navigate between different social contexts develop stronger executive function and greater mental agility than those who exist in homogeneous environments. Your brain is literally rewiring itself to be more adaptable. This happens because you're constantly practicing perspective shifts, adjusting communication styles, and moving between different social scripts. While people who've always fit in have one way of being in the world, you've got several. And that flexibility translates into every area of life. In practical terms, this makes you better at handling change, learning new skills, pivoting when plans fall apart, and thriving in uncertain environments. When the world shifts, insiders panic because their one way of operating no longer works. You've been adapting your whole life. Change isn't scary when flexibility is your default setting. That's not a disadvantage. That's being built for a world that's constantly evolving. By the way, if you're finding this perspective shift helpful, I post content like this regularly. I'd appreciate if you subscribed. Thanks. Reduced groupthink vulnerability. One of the most valuable advantages of being an outsider is that you're immune to groupthink. While insiders are unconsciously conforming to group consensus, even when it's clearly wrong, you're free to think independently. Research in social psychology, particularly Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments, shows that people will literally deny what they see with their own eyes to fit in with a group. But outsiders? They're significantly more likely to trust their own judgment. This happens because you're not invested in maintaining group harmony or protecting your position within a hierarchy. You don't have the same social pressure to agree with the consensus because you're not worried about losing acceptance you never fully had in the first place. That distance gives you clarity. In practical terms, this makes you better at critical thinking, identifying flawed logic, and speaking up when everyone else is nodding along to a bad idea. Some of the most important voices in history, the people who challenged obviously wrong but widely accepted ideas, were outsiders who weren't psychologically bound to groupthink. Your lack of belonging isn't isolating you from truth. It's protecting you from collective delusion. Higher resilience and grit. Being an outsider is hard. But here's what most people miss. That difficulty is building something incredibly valuable. Every time you face exclusion, navigate a space where you don't quite fit, or push forward despite not having the automatic advantages insiders get, you're developing resilience that can't be taught in any other way. Research on adversity and resilience shows that people who overcome social challenges develop significantly higher levels of psychological toughness than those who've had easier paths. This isn't about toxic positivity or pretending struggle is fun. It's about recognizing that your brain responds to challenges by building stronger coping mechanisms, deeper determination, and greater perseverance. This happens because you've had to work harder for things that came easily to others, and that effort builds mental muscle. While insiders might crumble the first time they face real adversity because they're not used to things being difficult, you've been training for this your whole life. In practical terms, this makes you more likely to persist through setbacks, recover from failures, and ultimately succeed in competitive environments. Resilience is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success, stronger than talent, stronger than intelligence, and you're building it every day. Innovation and problem-solving edge. Here's something business research consistently shows. The most innovative companies, the biggest breakthroughs, the solutions that change entire industries, they almost always come from outsiders. Not because outsiders are inherently smarter, but because they're not trapped by insider assumptions about what's possible or how things should work. When everyone in a field has the same training, the same networks, the same way of thinking, they generate the same solutions. But when an outsider looks at the problem, they see it differently. Research on innovation shows that cognitive diversity, particularly the perspective of people outside the mainstream of a field, is one of the strongest predictors of breakthrough thinking. This happens because you're not constrained by industry best practices or this is how we've always done it. You're asking questions insiders stopped asking years ago because the answers seemed obvious to them. In practical terms, this makes outsiders incredibly valuable in business, tech, creative fields, and any domain that needs fresh thinking. Companies are starting to realize this, actively recruiting people with non-traditional backgrounds because they need perspectives that can't come from inside the echo chamber. Your outsider status isn't a liability in your career. In the right environment, it's your most valuable asset, deeper self-reliance. When you can't rely on automatic group support, you develop something most people never fully cultivate: genuine self-reliance. Not the toxic individualism that pretends we don't need anyone, but a real internal strength and trust in your own capabilities. Research in developmental psychology shows that people who develop independence through necessity rather than choice often have stronger internal locus of control and greater self-efficacy than those who've always had external support systems. This happens because you've had to figure things out on your own, make decisions without consensus, and trust your judgment when others weren't validating it. Every time you did that, you were building evidence for yourself that you're capable, that you can handle things, that you don't need permission or approval to move forward. And that internal confidence, it's unshakable in a way that externally based confidence never is. In practical terms, this makes you more decisive, more willing to take calculated risks, and less paralyzed by others' opinions. You're not constantly looking around for validation before acting. You've learned to validate yourself. And in a world where most people are trapped by fear of what others think, that freedom is extraordinary. Selective social connections. Being an outsider means you probably have fewer friends than people who easily fit in, but here's what matters. The friendships you do have are likely deeper, more authentic, and more meaningful. Research on social relationships shows that people who are selective about their connections often report higher relationship satisfaction than those with large, superficial social networks. This happens because when you're not accepted everywhere, you get really good at identifying who's genuinely worth your time and energy. You don't waste effort on surface level connections or relationships based on proximity and convenience. You seek out people who see you, who get you, who value what makes you different rather than tolerating it. And those relationships, they're built on authenticity rather than social obligation. In practical terms, this means your small circle is probably more supportive, more loyal, and more genuinely connected than the sprawling networks insiders maintain. Quality over quantity isn't just a nice saying, it's a relationship philosophy that actually leads to greater well-being. Your smaller social world isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of discernment, cross-cultural intelligence. Here's an advantage that's becoming increasingly valuable. If you've spent your life as an outsider, you've probably developed the ability to navigate different social contexts, understand unstated rules, and adapt to various cultural environments. That's called cultural intelligence, and it's one of the most sought-after skills in our globalized world. Research shows that people with outsider experiences develop significantly higher cultural competence than those who've only existed in homogeneous environments. This happens because you've been doing what anthropologists call participant observation your whole life. You're simultaneously in a culture and observing it from outside, which gives you both insider knowledge and outsider perspective. You understand code switching not as a theory, but as a daily practice. In practical terms, this makes you incredibly valuable in diverse workplaces, international contexts, and any situation that requires bridging different groups or perspectives. While people who've always fit in struggle when they encounter difference, you're comfortable in that space. You've been translating between worlds forever. And as workplaces become more diverse and global, that ability isn't just useful, it's essential. Freedom from status anxiety. Here's something liberating about being an outsider. You're free from the exhausting game of status maintenance that consumes so much of insiders' energy. When you're not competing for position in a hierarchy you're not fully part of, you're released from constant social comparison and status anxiety. Research in sociology and psychology shows that people embedded in social hierarchies experience significant stress from maintaining and defending their position. But outsiders, they're largely immune to that pressure. This happens because you're not invested in the same status markers that drive insider behavior. You're not worried about being seen at the right events, knowing the right people, or performing the right signals of belonging because those games were never fully open to you anyway. And weirdly, that exclusion is freeing. In practical terms, this means you can make decisions based on what actually matters to you rather than what maintains your social position. You can take risks insiders can't because you're not protecting status you don't have. You can be honest in ways that would be social suicide for someone worried about their reputation within the group. That freedom, it's not just psychological, it's practical. It allows you to live more authentically and take paths that insiders trapped by status concerns never can. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future uploads. Thanks for watching.